Coast to coast.
Demerara and Essequibo 99.1 FM.
Burby's 99.5 FM. Kaieteur Radio.
Guyana is now a full-fledged oil-producing nation. But how much do you know about this valuable yet finite resource? On our radio program, Guyana's Oil and You, we strike at the heart of every issue with informed views and credible data. The time is now for you to arm yourself with insightful knowledge on your oil wealth. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, editor of Kaieteur News, Kian Wilberg, and our guest for tonight's program is the president of the Center for International Environmental Law, Carol Moffett. Sir, thanks for joining us once again tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Kiana.
Excellent. So how are you doing in your neck of the woods?
Things are going well here. We are blessed in the U.S. With a vaccine rollout that seems to be going well, and I think this is one of the ways in which I think we've benefited in a way much of the world hasn't. And I think one of the things many of us are advocating for is for the U.S. to step up and play a much bigger role in making sure the rest of the world can access vaccines in the way that we've been able to.
Great. So even with all of that going on, you're still finding the time to discuss some really important matters here with us at Kaieteur Radio. So we thank you in advance for that. With that said, I'd like to head right into our discussion tonight as we have just about an hour. So, Mr. Moffett, there is a growing debate about where the energy transition, the transition to cleaner energy sources, will leave Guyana and its 10 billion barrels of oil resources. What is your take on where Guyana could find itself at the current pace it's going?
I think that's a really fundamentally important question, and I actually want to start with a headline that ran in Kaieteur News today.
Sure.
And it was about Chad, one of the leading oil producers in all of Africa. Chad has been producing oil since the 1990s, and its development was tied to oil at a time when it looked clear that oil had a future, when it was being argued that oil had a future. And yet, as the article noted, Chad is desperately seeking debt relief from the world. And Chad is not uncommon in this. Today I read an analysis of the 25-year history of the 10 largest oil producing nations in Africa, comparing their oil revenues and their oil production to their progress on the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is a critically important measure because unlike GDP, which simply measures how capital is moving through the economy, the Human Development Index asks, are people's lives getting better? And over the 26-year span that was evaluated for the 10 largest oil producing countries in Africa, what the researchers could not say in any clear way was that oil was contributing to human development. Oil economies were not making lives better. And, I think nowhere was this clearer than Nigeria. Nigeria is the largest oil producing country in Africa, producing 2 million barrels of oil a day. And it sits at 152nd on the Human Development Index. Wow. Very near the bottom. The highest ranking of those African oil exporting countries, the very highest ranking, only sat in the low 50s. So if you look at the history of countries that have tied their economies to oil for the last several decades, that history is one of broken promises and broken dreams. And I think the stark reality facing Guyana compared to Nigeria and Chad and Algeria is that those countries tied their economies to oil at a moment when oil had a future. If you look at the report that was issued by the IEA, the remarkable report that was issued by the IEA, just 2.5 weeks ago, you had the IEA recognize for the first time that if the world is to have any hope of staying below 1.5 degrees, countries need to immediately end investment in and development of new oil and gas resources. And the IEA didn't say we need to do this in 2030 or even 2025. It said we need to do it in 2021. We need to do it right now. And one of the things that hasn't received much attention in that coverage of the IEA is that the IEA has a long history of putting out the absolute rosiest projections possible for the oil industry.
Absolutely.
And the IEA has been wrong again and again and again in that it has always underestimated the speed of the transition, and it's always underestimated the speed of the risk to the industry. And this is, I think, no exception. And so you need to look at that IEA report as a best case scenario for the oil and gas industry. And you have the IEA saying, best case scenario, the oil industry has to begin immediately winding down. We can't begin expanding. And so I think the profound risk that Guyana faces is it's been asked to tie its economy, tie its development, and tie its future to oil and gas at a moment where the world is recognizing that oil and gas have no future. And I think there was a remarkable case that came out of Netherlands last week that really speaks to those realities. And, perhaps we can talk about that a little later in the call, but it really, that case really speaks to, the risks not only to oil producing companies, but to oil producing countries if they disregard where the markets are going, where the global economy will go.
Thank you for that really insightful perspective there, Muffet. And I'd like to just hone in on two crucial things that you said there. And one has to do with the aspect of, we get fixated sometimes on, the economy is going to grow by this percentage or that percentage, when really and truly that's not an accurate reflection of the standard of living of the ordinary man on the street. That doesn't necessarily mean that healthcare or education or the infrastructure of the country is getting any better. It really isn't. And I think, when the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, post the COVID-19 pandemic, had said, Guyana is poised to be one of the fastest growing economies you'll ever see, there was really this sort of bonanza, an oil bonanza. And I think with COVID, it's really important for us to start to pull back on some of those rosy pictures, as you would have said, that we have about oil and gas and tying the economy to that. And then on the other aspect, where you mentioned the International Energy Agency, very crucial report about the need to bring an end to the exploration of new oil and gas fields. And it's really crucial to hone in on that report, because that report does not say only the United States or only Europe or only the G20 countries or the G7 economies must do this. It was holistic, so I really thank you for raising those 2 points. If there's any other perspective that you'd like to add to that, you can go ahead before I move on to the next question.
I think that point that the perspective in the IEA was holistic and global is critically important, because it speaks to the fundamental reality that we have a shared global climate. And it doesn't matter where oil and gas are burned. regardless of where they're burned, regardless of where they're produced, they are going to contribute to climate change everywhere. And this is, I think, what leads into the critical importance of that decision in the case against Shell in the Netherlands. That decision was remarkable for a number of reasons.
Yes.
One reason, I apologize for my dogs barking in the background.
That's okay.
That decision was remarkable for a number of reasons. One is, for the first time, you have a court actually recognizing that the need to reach 1.5 degrees sets the relevant legal standard. And critically, that not only countries but companies have a responsibility to align their operations with that standard. So it was remarkable and important in that regard. But I think the way that it was most important and most relevant for Guyana is that the court in Shell also recognized very explicitly that Shell was responsible for the emissions from the oil and gas it produces, regardless of where the oil and gas were eventually burned. This is the Scope 3 emissions. And what the court recognized was, once that oil and gas come out of the ground, it's going to be burned. That burning is inevitable. And that burning will always lead to climate emissions. And so that recognition that you cannot divorce the production of oil and gas from the emissions that result when it's used is, I think, critical in understanding why the IEA had to make the decision it made and issue the report it issued. Even in the wake of the IEA's report, yet another really significant report has come out in recent days by Dr. Sven Teske, who is a researcher who has done some of the most consistently accurate modeling over the last 2 decades on the pace of the energy transition. And what Sven Teske's latest research shows is that the world can still meet the 1.5 degree target. We have the capacity to do so, but we cannot meet it with, not only can we not expand oil and gas production further, but the world is actually going to have to abandon some of the oil and gas it's already developed if we're going to stay below 1.5 degrees. And so I think all of that speaks to the fundamental reality that we're now in a period of very rapid transition, that leaves industries and countries who are not adapting to that reality extremely exposed.
Great. Now, on the same transition topic, Carol, one of the issues that we face in Guyana, many of the individuals who were part of this education campaign, is what do you say to the man on the street who is eager to have his standard of living improved, who's eager to have his children's college education taken care of? How do you get him to understand the importance of not supporting the wild development or exploration of the oil resources, and to support rather the use of cleaner energy, which might take a much longer time? How do you get him to see the importance of that? What would you say to him?
Well, the first thing that I need to acknowledge is that I'm not from Guyana, and so I would follow the lead of people in Guyana. But the way I might have that conversation is to begin by acknowledging that he's right, and that he has these rights: the right to develop, the right to have your children live in a better world, in a better country than you have lived in. That is an aspiration that all of us share, and that all of us should share in equally. And so the very first thing that I think it's really important to do is to acknowledge that goal, that dream is a legitimate one, and one that we need to support you in pursuing. But then the question becomes, how do you reach it? And this is where the lessons of the last quarter century of life in the African oil producing nations becomes clear, is that a quarter century that's seen skyrocketing human development? It's not. What you've seen is economies that are tied to massive commodity swings in the market. You've seen government revenues that plummet when oil and gas plummets. You've seen government revenues that disappear when oil and gas thrives. And pervasive questions about, well, this is the money that's supposed to be there. Where's the money that's actually reaching people's lives to make those lives better? And I think that is one of the most fundamental prerequisites of a just transition to a new world is honesty. And that means you can't tell someone that we're going to have a just transition without first acknowledging that we have to have a transition. And here, I think Guyana is actually in a rare and really valuable position because, yes, it's been sold this promise of future oil wealth, but Guyana's economy is not yet dependent on it. Exxon wants to make Guyana dependent on that idea, and certainly Guyana's been starting to see the bills from the development of oil and being told you need to pay this on the promise of future wealth. But Guyana still has a choice to make, and Guyana has tremendous energy potential. Guyana has tremendous potential in its people. How do you fully realize that potential? I think that's a conversation that the whole country needs to have together. I can't pretend that I have answers for it. What I can say is the first best answer is not to be deluded by the false promise of wealth that's never going to materialize for the vast majority of Guyana's people.
Thank you very much. Now, there's another narrative that I'd love to have your perspective on, and that comes from some sections of our society who say, well, we have nothing to worry about because if you really look at the energy transition and what the IEA has been saying, the International Energy Agency, we will need some amount of oil to go through the transition. And until that time, Guyana seems to be in a safe spot because of the characteristics of the oil that it has discovered, and that being that it's sweet, it's light, and it has low break-evens. So Guyana is going to survive the transition if it is to go ahead with the development of its resources. How do you feel about that?
I think there are a few things I would say about this. This is a good place to, remember that point that the IEA always tells the rosiest possible story for oil and gas. It has a long legacy of this, and it's consistently been very wrong. So much so that with every progressive world energy outlook that the IEA has done, it has had to dramatically revise upwards its estimation of the renewable energy transition, both in terms of scale and speed, and it's just consistently wrong on this. And I think one of the things that's really important to recognize is that the fact that the IEA did this report is laudable, but it doesn't change its track record. And one of the things that I've followed for a long time is the transition to electric vehicles. And one of the things that's been striking, it is, for people who haven't followed this closely, it seems like suddenly electric cars are everywhere, and suddenly major producers of cars are advertising electric vehicles and seem to really want to sell them. And that is sudden from the perspective of people who haven't been following. But if you've actually been watching what's been happening, what you'll actually see is that we are facing a tipping point where it's becoming less and less viable for the world's major car manufacturers to invest in and develop new vehicles that burn gas, because the markets for them are going to start disappearing in 2030, if not sooner. And the moment you start removing those big markets and taking them off the table, all of these vehicles that burn gas no longer make economic sense. And this is why you see virtually every major car producer in the world quickly moving to electrify their vehicle fleets. This has dramatic implications for global consumption of oil and gas, because we're going to see those vehicle fleets transitioning much more rapidly than anyone anticipated. And if you look on the gas side, gas had been positioned as a bridge fuel, as a way to get the world off coal. And what we saw is proponents in the industry were arguing that natural gas could be a bridge, but they didn't want the bridge to end. They said, natural gas is a bridge. We'll get on this bridge. We'll get off of it sometime decades from now. And what analysts, what governments, what even the IEA is now recognizing is, in fact, we have to get off natural gas really quickly as well, which means that assumption that natural gas is a bridge is itself falling apart much more rapidly than people assumed. And part of what makes the IEA's analysis of a future for oil possible is the IEA is assuming that the world is going to develop carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal at an unprecedented scale and at an unprecedented speed. And that it's going to do that as a way of making all that emitted carbon from the oil and gas magically disappear. But the grim reality facing the industry is that technology doesn't work. And even in the rare cases where it does work, it's so vastly expensive that it's making fossil fuel burning technologies that are already not competitive with renewable energy even less competitive. And so the economics of these solutions simply don't work, which is why they're widely recognized as false solutions. When you take all of this into account, what you begin to realize is that this energy transition that we're in is still going much too slowly from the perspective of the climate. But if you are in the oil and gas industry, this energy transition is moving with colossal speed. And I think the last thing that I'll mention here, and because it's happened only recently, is yes, Guyana has the benefit of oil that, according to Exxon, is extremely cheap to produce, not least because Guyana is picking up the tab for all the exploration and development costs. But the folks in the Permian Basin also thought the same thing. The folks in the Permian Basin thought, well, here at least, we're going to be producing till the bitter end. And the folks in Alberta's tar sands thought the same thing. Hey, you know what? Our oil is clean. We'll be producing to the bitter end. But banks and insurers and now governments are abandoning the tar sands, saying that you can't invest there. Shell just earlier this week announced that it is looking to sell all of its assets in the U.S. Permian Basin because it has to get those emissions off its books. Exxon just announced in recent days that it's selling some of its Permian Basin assets. And so if the Permian Basin, which sits at the heart of U.S. oil and gas U.S. gas industry and has a century of political power and industry experience behind it, can't weather this storm, the question for Guyana is, are you banking on the fact that somehow you'll do better? And I think that's a really risky bet to take.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Muffet. We'll go to a short commercial break, and when we return, we'll continue our discussion on some crucial topics in Guyana's oil and gas sector. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you're now joining us, this is Guyana's Oil and You, a special episode featuring the president of the Center for International Environmental Law, Mr. Carl Moffat. We would have discussed several issues in relation to the energy transition and where that leaves Guyana. Mr. Moffat, I'd like to continue our discussion now, looking at three major developments in the industry. You would have mentioned one earlier before we went to our first commercial break, and that has to do with Shell and the major case that occurred in the Netherlands. And the other two that I'd like to bring to the fore would be where ExxonMobil lost 3 of its board seats to Engine Number One, a very small hedge fund, which basically has no faith in the response plan ExxonMobil has to climate change. And then there's Chevron, the shareholders of which voted significantly for there to be a reduction in the emissions. Now, what do these 3 major shifts that we haven't seen in quite some time in the industry, what does that say for onlookers in Guyana? What lessons do you believe it holds that we should not ignore?
Absolutely, and to answer that question, I want to note a couple of things. First, all of these events happened in the wake of 2 things. First, they happened in the wake of the IEA report. They also happened in the wake of the filing of a constitutional case in Guyana itself, which is a first of its kind in the Caribbean. The first time that citizens in the Caribbean have gone to court against the fossil fuel production on the grounds that it violates their constitutional rights. And so that makes all of these developments critically important for Guyana. I touched on a couple of highlights from the Shell case, but there are a few other aspects of that case that I think are really fundamentally important to the future of the industry. One is that, the Shell court recognize that that climate change has profound implications for human rights, and that those implications for human rights create duties not only for governments but for corporations. Even more importantly for Shell, what the court found was that those duties applied not only to Shell in the Netherlands, not only to Royal Dutch Shell, the company that sits in the Netherlands, but to the entire Shell group, more than 1,100 subsidiaries and joint ventures and companies around the world. This, I think, must be sending shockwaves through the global oil industry. These are companies that have mastered the art of legally existing in a country when they want to exist and legally disappearing from that country when they don't want to exist there. And what the court in the Netherlands has said is, regardless of what name you put on the mailbox, regardless of where you say this venture exists, you're responsible as a company for the emissions globally. And I think that sets a profound precedent for the global oil and gas industry, including for companies like Exxon. I mentioned the fact that the court in the Shell case held that companies are going to be responsible not only for the emissions from their operations, which in Exxon's case in Guyana are already massive, but for the emissions from the produced oil, which are orders of magnitude greater. In the Shell case, the Shell's emissions from the burning of oil and gas globally were 85% of the company's global climate impact. And so when the court says, Shell, you need to reduce your emissions by 45%, they were talking about the emissions from all of that, including from the produced oil, which may be why Shell is trying to offload some of its Permian assets now. And there are 2 other aspects of that Shell case that have gone unremarked, and they shouldn't. One is the court in the Shell case said that Shell has to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030. That's less than 10 years away. And what's really significant about that is if you look at the business models and you look at the climate plans of companies like Shell, part of the ways that they say that they're going to contribute to climate targets is by reducing carbon emissions decades in the future. In 2050 and 2060, 2070, they say, we'll start pulling carbon out of the atmosphere to offset all the carbon we put in. When the court says Shell has to cut its emissions by 2030, that takes those future carbon-sucking unicorns off the table, and it means that the companies have to be doing real reductions. The final thing that I want to note from the Shell case is that the court, without making this a ruling, the court then drew a really obvious conclusion. It said one very likely consequence of this is that Shell is going to have to change how it invests, and it's going to have to change what assets it's developing. And so that, I think, sends a really clear signal to the industry as a whole that you can't go on pretending that business as usual works anymore. And that aligns with what the IEA says, and it aligns with what the investors demanded from both Exxon and Chevron. I think it is easy to understate, and it's easy to understate how profound a shareholder revolution like Exxon experienced is. Management is really good at dominating boards, and when there are plays to take over board seats against the advice of management and the controlling investors, it's always because there's money at stake. And I think this is one of the things that's really significant about Engine 1 and that AGM. Exxon's investors did this not necessarily out of any profound concern for climate, but because they know that Exxon, by failing to recognize these mounting climate risks, is putting their money and the entire business at stake along with the planet. And, in the lead up to the Exxon AGM, a group of more than 130 Exxon investors actually recognized that as well and put out a report called Cure Exxon, which highlighted just how Exxon's massive investments in the Permian Basin, in the tar sands in Mozambique and other places were out of alignment with the Paris Agreement. And one way this then becomes immediately relevant to Guyana is that in the wake of that report and right after the Exxon AGM, dozens of people from Guyana wrote to those same Exxon investors and said, you're right about those risks, you're right about this lack of alignment. Have you looked at the situation in Guyana? Here's a massive climate risk that Exxon's not talking to its investors about. And so Guyana is now on investors' radar in the same way that Mozambique and the Permian Basin and the tar sands were. And that brings me to Chevron, which is in some way is every bit as shocking as what happened in the Exxon case. It's important to recognize that shareholder resolutions and activist shareholder resolutions are not uncommon. They're brought all the time. But particularly with resolutions that are concerning the environment or social issues or human rights or climate change, historically, if you get past 7 or 8% of the shareholders, that's a solid showing. You've made an impact. You get to 20% of shareholders, and that is a really high-performing shareholder resolution. In the Chevron case, they got 60% of the votes. And you don't get 60% of the votes of the shareholders unless you're getting 60% of the assets invested in the company saying, Chevron, you are on the wrong course. You need to be on a dramatically different course. And so we're at this moment where you look at 3 of the longest-lived oil companies on the planet, and all of them in the space of a week have been forced to confront the reality that climate change means they have to change their business models fundamentally, or their business models will fail.
Thank you for that wrap up there. But I'd like to put the spotlight. You noted a report from Engine 1 and many of the other investors who would have formed this coalition to take on ExxonMobil on some crucial issues and thereby winning some of the board seats. Your institution as well, your organization, would have also published a very important report, and that one is called Toxic Assets, Making Polluters Pay When Wells Run Dry and the Bill Comes Due. This was published April 2021. Can you tell our audience a bit about this document and one of the key lessons that it holds for Guyana?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that is least recognized about the global oil and gas industry is that the end of a well's economic life is not the end of the well's life. If it's not cleaned up, if it's not closed up properly, it poses profound and mounting risks to the environment, to water supplies, to wildlife, to human health, and to human rights. Our Toxic Assets report looked at the reality that as we face a growing wave of bankruptcies in the industry, a growing need to transition away from oil and gas, the number of wells that have reached the end of their lives is growing rapidly. And this is an industry that has for decades been very effective at essentially kicking the can down the road in terms of cleaning up end-of-life wells. And so many wells sit there unabated, unremediated, polluting for decades until they are properly cleaned up. And often, even in countries like the U.S., where the regimes are long established, industry's proven very effective at avoiding the financial obligations to clean up properly, and proven very effective at transferring those obligations to the public. And this is what becomes really relevant for Guyana in its future. If you look at Exxon's proposed developments, it's got Liza 1 and Liza 2 and Payara already moving quickly. Yellowtail is close behind. And Exxon's plans include up to 92 wells. This is a massive development in a really short span of time. And I think one thing that we found in our analysis is that Exxon's commitments to clean up those wells are extremely ambiguous, and primarily they shift again the burden to the people of Guyana, both the financial burden, because Guyana is paying in advance for the closing costs of those wells, but in return they're not getting any explicit, clear, tangible commitment from Exxon that the wells will actually be closed properly, and how will they be closed properly. And so what this means for the people of Guyana is that in addition to the massive costs that they've taken on for the exploration and the development, and that they'll continue to pay for future exploration and development as more and more wells come online, in addition to the massive risks from the ongoing flaring, the massive risks, in the event of a blowout or a spill that could affect not only Guyana, but the wider Caribbean region. In addition to all of those risks, the people of Guyana face the very real possibility that if the standards aren't tightened, they could be left on the hook for the cleanup costs of ultra deep water wells. And it's really important to recognize that ultra deep water wells are profoundly more costly and profoundly more complex to close down, to shut in, and to clean up than wells you would find on land. And so this is why we called that case study In Deep Water.
Indeed. And so, Carol, that is a topic that we ourselves at Kaieteur News, we're trying to enlighten our audience about. And we've also mentioned that really detailed report there, which speaks to the importance of decommissioning and the costs associated with that. So hopefully, we can continue that discussion and continue to bring the facts to the Guyanese public. On that note, we are coming to the wrapping up section of our program. But with that, I'd love to have your concluding thoughts on Guyana's treatment of the environment alongside its exploration and development plans for its oil. Your parting words as well on your advice to the people and the government where this is concerned. I know that we've had you quite a couple of times before speaking on matters of flaring and what's not over a year now, but what's your thoughts?
Guyana is remarkably rich. It's a remarkably wealthy country with respect to its people, with respect to the diversity of its people, the diversity of its wildlife, and its massive and still largely pristine forests, which are a profound rarity in the world. And I think Guyana is to be lauded for that. And at the same time, it's important to recognize that Guyana has faced a host of environmental risks from extractive industries over time. And I think that means Guyana is also uniquely suited to recognize the profound trade-offs that come with the promises of industry. And on the flip side, what are the consequences? I think when it comes to what that means for oil and how Guyana is managing the environment in the context of oil, I think the really fundamental question is Guyana managing the environment in the context of oil? I think the real risk here is that Guyana has no experience with this industry. They've been running to catch up, but we see again and again and again that Guyana's regulators are constantly finding that they didn't cross some I, that they didn't dot some I, they didn't cross some T, and that there's yet another loophole that the industry has, so it can go on emitting, so it can go on flaring, so it can go on producing more waste. I think the real risk for Guyana and its people is that we're in the early stages, and I think the warning signs are there. These impacts can add up. They can add up both slowly, and in the event of a catastrophic spill or well blow up, they can add up with profound and staggering speed. And so there is still time for Guyana. Guyana can still protect its environment. Guyana can still protect its people by saying, we've seen what you've tried to do here. It's not working for the people of Guyana. It's not working for the communities here. It's not working for the environment here. Thank you, no. And I think that, I think that how you do that is, it is complex, but I think this is the place where, when more and more people in Guyana choose to make that stand, that's where you have a growing number of people in the world paying attention, listening, and saying, we will support you in whatever way we can.
Thank you very much for that comment there, and even your previous perspectives, Carol. Certainly, I know that my audience has been able to benefit a lot from your perspectives, and I do hope that we can continue to have you back on the Guyana Oil and You program, where you can share your insights with us on some of the very important topics that need to be discussed in the Guyana oil and gas industry. So once again, sir, thank you so much for participating once again. And to our audience, we always love to have you on board with us. Until next time, please continue to stay safe, wear your mask, practice social distancing, and if you haven't already, please get the vaccine. Regardless of the nonsense that you're hearing, please get the vaccine and keep your families and your loved one safe. Carol, once again, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good night.
Kaieteur Radio, keeping you informed.
Demerara and Essequibo 99.1 FM.
Burby's 99.5 FM.